First, I want to thank the Seacoast Art Association for inviting me to do this talk. And this talk is going to be about how I created a process that I call Reconstructed Watercolor to overcome a creative block. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Jane Zeeb McDonnell. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania. I always wanted to be an artist since the time I could remember, but then life happened. Becoming an artist got put on the back burner. I married, had 2 kids, moved to Massachusetts, got divorced, raised 2 kids, mostly as a single mother, so not working was not an option. But like many other artists, I was able to have a creative career as a graphic designer, and then an art director, and later even a store artist at a Whole Foods. Also, through those years, I managed to take art classes and workshops from time to time. This allowed me to experience a wide variety of mediums, including watercolor, oil, a variety of printmaking processes. I took a pottery class and encaustic, and it was fun. I love trying new creative processes. But I also realized that to become really good at any process, I would have to devote time to it. So I chose watercolor to be my medium. Watercolor was the medium that I started with. Back when I was in 7th grade, my mother had an artist friend who did watercolor plein air workshops with kids in the summer, and she signed me up. I also grabbed my watercolors throughout all those years I had to work when I did have some time and inspiration. I usually did 1 painting a year. And I also love the spontaneity of watercolor. I love how wet into wet acts. And I don't know of any other medium that does that except for maybe encaustic. And I also needed a process. There's some chairs up here too. I also needed a process to challenge my tendency to be a control freak. So when I remarried to my current husband, I was able to go to school to get my degree in art, always thinking that having a degree would make me a legitimate artist. But after graduation, I had to go back into the work world and was unable to devote all of my time to art until after I retired, and at the same time we moved to Maine. At first I was on a roll. We were living in Kittery while we looked for land to build a house. That's when I discovered Sanctuary Arts and signed up to take a watercolor class with DeWitt Hardy. And this is also where I met the Mainly Painters, a plein air group that gets together every Tuesday, and I've been active with them since 2015. But then things started to change. It was gradual at first. I did spend time and creativity on designing my new home, plus I had a whole blank yard to landscape. But more and more, I spent my time gardening and less time painting, until I was hardly painting at all, and worst of all, I hated everything I did. And this started to feel like an identity crisis, because as I said, all my life I wanted to be an artist, and now I have the time and no excuses really, but I just wasn't into it. So I needed to figure this out. Of course, I did research online about how to overcome a creative block. And I found this one website called The Pointless Artist was most helpful. And she describes a creative block as a crisis and says, a crisis also encourages introspection, an inward turn that harbors the potential for inner transformation and a mindset shift. A crisis can be a time of personal renewal and reinvention as an artist. So the first thing I did was commit to going into my studio at the same time every day. My thinking was I needed to form a habit and get some introspection. And then when there, I started to think about art and what it means to be an artist and what kind of artist am I. So on the what does it mean to be an artist question, well, as I say in my artist statement, I felt like I needed a degree, so I got one. And I felt like I had to sell art, so I sold some. But then I began to realize that to be an artist simply means you have to make art. So why wasn't I making any? And how was I spending my now abundance of time? I was gardening. I spent my time gardening. So what was it about gardening that made that fun, and why wasn't painting fun anymore? Well, one problem that I identified based on my research, I was more focused on the final product and not the process. In other words, I worried too much about what the final painting looked like. Us visual artists like to look at things. I know especially when I first moved to Maine, I couldn't stop looking at the sky and the trees and the ocean, and then it's almost natural to want to recreate that in your painting. But that's when painting became frustrating, because in reality, I didn't want my painting to look like a photograph. I wanted it to capture how I felt when I looked at the sky and the trees and the ocean. I would get a vision in my head of what I was trying to create, and I would get excited, but the final painting often disappointed me. I remember when I was young and making art all the time, I was a kid who loved coloring books, and I didn't care about the finished product much. I would draw pictures and give them away, and I would draw on any surface I would get my hands on. And for example, this is a folder that my mother kept her art in. And you know what? I'll pass it around. It's like my 5 or 7-year-old art, but my mother was an illustrator and a dress designer, and so that's what her paintings were. And you can see the influence of the design of the clothes on my drawings. So she saved it? She gave me all her art. I donated her art to the Philadelphia Historical Society because that's where she went to school, but I kept that. But in general, I love kid art, and I think it's very informative to look at your own if you still have any. But needless to say, I enjoyed the process. Well, the idea of process really hit me one day when I was walking on the beach with my grandsons, and I came across this. So this was a real eye-opener for me. Some artist came along and spent time creating this, knowing full well that it would be washed away with high tide. So, should I pass this around, or is this good? Good, okay. So I started to think about my art in terms of process. That's how gardening is. Actually, I like the fact that gardening is a combination of different processes. I can spend time on the computer researching and planning out a garden or a new garden space, investigate plant problems, or just mindlessly pull weeds or spread mulch, and endlessly jump from one task to the other and never getting bored. So, on the question of what kind of artist am I? In my studio, I have lots of wall space to hang things. And I hang work that I'm working on, work that I like, and work that inspires me. And of all the work I did in school, I have these two pieces, this one and this. Wow. And this is original work, but I will pass this around too, because you gotta get the. Oh my goodness. Okay, so This is obviously, this was done on a 20 by 24 sheet. This is a printout of it. Our assignment was to make a self-portrait collage using shades of gray. So like I said, this was on a larger 20 by 40 inch piece of paper. This is a smaller printout of it. My husband, who was a printer at the time, brought home half-inch squares of paper in shades of gray, going from white to black. And I used these to create this very mosaic-looking self-portrait that looks best when viewed from a distance and preferably in dim light. This other piece that I'm passing around, it's a smaller acrylic done on paper that I since mounted on foam core to bring here. And I did that by squeezing paint out from a frosting decorator tip. So up close you can see all the dots and the texture of them, but from a distance it's a still life, like pointillism. But what do these two pieces have in common? Well, I love work that speaks to me from a distance and then sucks you in up close to enjoy every little detail. I'm the type of artist that has to stand back and look at my work in progress. That's why I hang it on the walls. The other thing these two pieces have in common is the tedious process. The frosting bag tip piece was so tedious, I know I would never do that again. But I began to realize the reason why these are the only two pieces that I have hanging in my studio from school is to remember the process of making art is fun. So while sitting in my studio, I began to go through my piles of watercolor paintings. Some were successful and frame-worthy, some were total duds, and some were just simple painting exercises or practices. But most were like meh, you know, not great, but not too bad. Often I'd like one part of a painting, but not the rest. And these meh paintings became the underpaintings of this process I call Reconstructed Watercolor. This is a printout of the first Reconstructed Watercolor that I did. It's called Can't See the Forest for the Dots, and it's a 18 by 24, and this I did on canvas. While watercolor is not usually done on canvas, I was trying something new. This is often suggested when you're trying to get out of a creative block. So I found this watercolor ground that could be applied to canvas, so I thought I'd give it a try, but I didn't like the way the paint acted on the surface. So it became an unsuccessful painting. And then I looked around my studio and I picked up this. And I started to punch holes out of different colors out of the scraps of the bad watercolor paintings I had around. And then using tacky glue, just like what you get at Michael's, and I water down a little bit and apply it with a brush, I started to attach the dots to the canvas. My hand started to hurt from punching all these dots, so I went to Michael's and I found this. And it's easier in my hand and also has the ability of creating different size dots. So I became obsessed with this process. This piece took me many weeks to finish. But I was really excited about making art again. I searched online but couldn't find any examples of anyone doing anything like this, so I decided to call it Reconstructed Watercolor. And I think it was the first winter in a long time that I made art instead of doing puzzles. So one thing for sure, Reconstructed Watercolor is a time-consuming process. And I don't mind the time-consuming part. A lot of the process is relaxing, similar to how some people find knitting or crocheting. And I know I'll never be the type of artist that can go into my studio and work on a single painting for hours, day in and day out. That's just not me. I needed to create a process that had many different steps and features, including some that I can do even when I only have small bits of time or I'm low on energy. I was drawing on my gardening experience. So before I open it up for discussion, I would like to just return to the main theme of this talk, how I overcame a creative block. And I think the short answer to that question is actually understanding who you are. For me, it meant coming up with this process, but I know it doesn't apply to everyone. Especially since moving to Maine, I have the opportunity to hang out with a lot of artists. So I know from having shown this work to other artist friends, some of you think I'm crazy, and I get it. As much as an artist, us artists have a lot of things in common. We're creative. We have a need to express ourselves through art. We love art supplies. But we are also all very different people. Why does one artist choose watercolor and another oil, or sculpting, or printmaking, or singing, or dancing? There are different processes. These are all different processes, and I think each of us gravitate toward the process that best links to our individual personalities. That's why process is so much more important than the outcome or the final product. Process is us expressing ourselves. The final product, the artwork, that can be sold. So, and people can come and look at my little mini studio if they'd like. Yes?
What is your preferred substrate?
Well, I did 2 on canvas. That's definitely non-preferred because the canvas has so much give. I found that I had to put something under the canvas to make it firm because the dots, if they didn't like dry completely flat, they would sometimes like come off when it dries and stuff. It was just harder. So my preferred substrate really is MDF boards.
Okay.
I have, some of them are on 1/4 inch and some of them are on 1/2 inch. Yes?
Do you prime the MDF with something first? Or?
Yeah, gesso. I gesso both sides.
Just one coat?
Sometimes 2 if it goes on thin. And then I put down like some kind of acrylic medium. And this is where I've kind of come into some problems in the past. I have to spread the acrylic medium on the substrate and also on the paper. And then with a roller, I have to really flatten it on because I've had trouble with like sort of air pockets happening, which I forget which piece it was, but I actually had one where I had to put a hole in the paper to try to squeeze some more glue in there to make it stick. So, yes?
Do you use something to seal it afterward?
Yes.
Self-level?
I've been experimenting with that, but I think I found this product that I really like a lot. It's it's UVSC, which I think is protective, whatever. It comes in satin, matte, and gloss, and it's what I've been using, and I think I like it the best. Yeah.
What is the brand?
It's Create Text Colors. I think I got it on either Amazon or Dick Blick. Yeah.
June, I have a question.
Yes.
So, when you're punching holes, do you have an idea of the colors that you're looking for, or do you just sit down and punch holes like you would, an artist would have a palette and to mix? I mean, are you constantly punching holes and you have like an inventory of here's the brown?
Well, I'm
circles
starting to collect a lot of excess dots. So I've actually started doing just these little things to experiment with like different patterns and also to use the extra dots. But so sort of how I would do it is like say this piece, when I was working on it, I knew I needed a lot of green, and green's one of my favorite colors, so I do have a lot of, so I have like piles on the floor of different things, sort of somewhat divided by color. And then I would find a piece and punch out a bunch of dots. Now, one of the things I recently found is this is like a tacky mat. So rather than just have the dots in a pile and then they flip over, and some, I have two-sided, so some of them have different colors on each side. But with this, I'm able to like lay them out and they kind of stick on here. So when it comes time to gluing, because one of the big issues I have is you can only put glue on a patch like that big because the glue dries. So I try to lay out my dots that I'm going to use for that section, then I can quickly move them. And I use an X-Acto knife to pick up the dots and stick them on the glue.
So do you have a drawing ahead of time, or do you just start placing them?
So most of them, I started off with the paintings. Like this one, for example. This was the sunflower. And then I had this other yellow flower here, and it just like was distracting. So I knew I wanted to cover that. So that's why like most of this flower is the original watercolor. But then all the rest of the background is covering up what I didn't like. So most of them are like like this. It's hard for me to paint a large watercolor. It's just, there's a whole, like you have to have more paint mix, and it's just a whole different, so this was like not really successful until I dotted it up. And I moved these. The other thing is I had bought a star punch that I wanted to use, but stars can be kind of tacky looking, but I thought it worked really good for the cut glass of that vase. And so,
So you had a watercolor already done, and then you added all of the...
yeah, so the whole background was a watercolor with the flowers, and so I just used that as sort of, the background to attach the different colors.
Are the stars and the dots almost always one layer, or do you layer them up?
Okay, so they've all been one layer up until I started working on actually, this piece has an extra layer. This is a work in process, so it's not done yet. But this one has 3 layers, but usually I try to keep it to 2.
3 layers of dots, or just your layer of painting, then your layer of dots, and another layer of dots?
Yes, so the painting, and then, so this was I hated the sky in this, but I kind of liked the buildings, and I kind of liked the rocks. So I cut the sky out, and then I so that's basically on the background of this painting of the sky. Then I put this layer of the buildings back on, and then another layer on top. One of the things I started to do for like greenery is using the part that's left over from the dots.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that so these are some cards that I had made. Oh, here, this is a good one. So all this greenery in here is like the part left over from from the dots.
Yeah.
Also, I'm starting to get this idea that I want to do birds. So there's some birds in here, but I started working out some sketches of how to make birds, almost like origami-ish, out of basically triangles. So that's something that's coming up.
So then with the birds, you would use scissors to cut out the little tiny pieces?
Or like I do have my paper cutter, and then also X-Acto knife, and a ruler even, Yeah.
I love this stuff and everything. I'm just curious, do you ever try torn pieces instead of punches?
I actually tried tearing before I started doing this, but it was just too, it wasn't controlled enough for me, you
You are
know?
appropriate.
You know?
When you tear, you end up with kind of the white edge.
Exactly, and you know, you
But
can't
you-
really control exactly
Yeah,
how you tear
can
it.
use it to your advantage, but it also is something else to use.
But I do have a piece in my studio that I tried doing that, and I just stopped because it wasn't working for me. Yeah.
Could you pass around that one that has the greenery that's the leftover, just so that we can see that up close?
Oh, this, yeah. That's one that I recently finished, so I don't even have, it's not even wired on the back yet.
You really have to look at these closely.
Yeah, and that's,
Yeah.
When you apply this, do you usually apply it with a brush?
yes,
Just
but
kind of
before,
self-level or-
before I do, I also like fix it really well.
Okay.
So what I do is when I decide on, you know, the paint, so this one for, this actually is a commission, this lighthouse. So I had to do that painting, you know, first. I actually did 3 of them and then chose that one to work on. So after I have the painting, then I fix it with this so the color doesn't lift when you put like the glue on and wet it and stuff,
Okay,
color can
yeah,
lift. So
yeah.
I'll spray it with this first, then I attach, and then the pieces that are getting attached also have the ability to, when you put that on. So then I'll spray it with this again, then I'll put that finish on it.
Okay.
This is some of, go on.
Well, the glue, is it like forever glue? I mean,
So, I'm not, like, I mean, I'm sure it's forever because there's so much other stuff on top. But I'm trying to find a glue that might stay wet longer. So if anybody has any suggestions, I'm totally open. Because, like I said, I can only work on a size like that big before the glue starts to dry up and then the dots don't stick anymore. They end up.
So if you misplace it, can you lift them off?
So, sometimes. I actually had one, I don't remember exactly which one, but I hated everything that I put on. And so I put like a damp paper towel on it for a while, and then I was able to scrape up some of it, but some of the glue, like, but the thing, like if I let the glue harden on my brush, it will soften up and loosen with water, so.
I'm wondering if you can put a retarder, like you use for acrylic paint.
Does that work?
Into your medium.
Does that work for acrylic paint?
Yeah, so.
Oh.
I wonder if you use a retarder.
I might try that. Thank you.
You know, Golden, they've got an awesome customer service.
Oh, okay.
Problem solve that.
All right. Yeah, because I would put it down with like some kind of a medium if it stayed open longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
So that Golden is wonderful. They're,
Yeah,
family-owned business and they're like so
Oh.
helpful. They just want to help you.
Yeah. So, any other questions, or if anybody, if you want to come look at my stuff? Yeah, this is the, like,